William Stilwell, and I'm part of the history program here at King's Chapel. I've been with the chapel since the fall of 2016 as one of the historic site educators and one of the people responsible for some of the programming here tonight or here in general. So let me just here share my screen so we can do this. Here we go. All right. Okay. So tonight's program is entitled Liberty and Death, King's Chapel, and the Crypt in the American Revolution. So really what we're going to be talking about here tonight is the American Revolution in Boston through the lens of death and burial at King's Chapel. Something that we really like to talk about at the chapel, and, you know, in more normal times, if we were back giving tours, tours of the crypt are a highlight of any educator's experience at King's Chapel, and something that I know a lot of visitors really are interested in. And it's a pretty interesting, lens in which to talk about the American Revolution in Boston. So what we're really going to be drawing from today are both the crypt and the burial register. And I want to make a distinction here that looking through the burial register at King's Chapel, having someone's name listed in the burial register, I should say, does not mean that they were interred within the crypt. In fact, very few, individuals, only about 150 over the course of about 100 years, were ever interred down in the crypt. A name in the burial register, all it really means is that the religious capacity of the burial or the funeral came through King's Chapel in some way. So there's far more names listed on the burial register than there are down in the crypt. So I want to start with the burial register and chronologically start in the basically late winter, early spring of 1770. Now, Faye's program last week touched upon this a little more in depth, but I still want to talk about it here. Here's an excerpt from the burial register. Again, this is February 1770 into early March 1770. And we have here February 26th, last one of February, Christopher Sider, apprentice, age 11 years old. Christopher Sider was a young son of German immigrants, poor family, who was among a crowd that had gathered around the home of a known loyalist named Ebenezer Richardson. This crowd was agitating Richardson, throwing projectiles into his windows out to his home, and Richardson opened up his door and fired a shot out into the crowd, and that killed young Christopher Sider. His funeral ended up being a big affair in Boston. It was sort of a galvanizing moment. Very much a political funeral that took place after his death. And descriptions of his funeral hit the Boston papers on March 5th, 1770, the morning of the Boston Massacre. And so in many ways, Christopher Sider's death is associated with the Boston Massacre. It's certainly something people in the moment would have been making that connection. He's someone who would have been on the minds of the people in Boston on the day of the Boston Massacre. And we have here on March 17th, Patrick Carr, laborer, the last name listed here, age 30. Patrick Carr was an Irishman, and he's the last victim of the Boston Massacre. The day of the massacre, 3 men, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks, were all killed instantly. The 4th victim, Samuel Maverick, died the next day, and Patrick Carr hung on for a whole week before he succumbed to his injuries. He'd been shot basically from hip to hip on Quaker Lane, just off of modern-day State Street. And so you can see here, it's the headstone to the victims of the Boston Massacre. They were buried together in the Granary Burying Ground. And you can see Patrick Carr and Christopher Sider, it's spelled Snyder on here, share this headstone. You can see that connection here between Sider's death and Patrick Carr's death. And both of these individuals have connections to King's Chapel beyond being buried by the minister of King's Chapel, Henry Kaner. What we have here On the left is Grizel Apthorpe, prominent member of the congregation for many years. And Christopher Sider had been living with her basically due to how poor his family was. So he'd been staying with her, and she lived actually basically within sight of where the massacre happened. It happened basically in front of her home. And this is probably why Henry Kaner buried Sider, because of this connection. And then in the case of Patrick Carr, he was treated by two physicians of Boston, Dr. John Jeffries, who is the gentleman in the middle here, and Dr. James Lloyd, who we have here the image of the crypt at King's Chapel, the Lloyd family tomb. So both Dr. Jeffries and Lloyd were members of King's Chapel. They treat Carr and his injuries and record his thoughts on what happened. And basically this deathbed testimony of Patrick Carr is going to be read before the massacre trial by Dr. Jeffries toward the end of the trial, where Carr basically forgives the soldiers. He says that the crowd was the reason the soldiers fired. And this was really shocking and bombshell testimony, and, considered very strong. It's not hearsay when it's, a deathbed revelation like this. And this is probably one of the things that contributed to the soldiers being acquitted. And so, you can kind of see King's Chapel's connections here to this event of the Boston Massacre, and sort of where Boston's at the time. Boston's a small town. It's not hard to find these types of connections to events like this. Now, there we go. We're going to move on a little bit here in the burial register. Now, British troops occupy Boston from 1774 until March of 1776. You have the battles of Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775. And from then until March of 76, not only is Boston occupied by British soldiers, it's being besieged by colonial militias and later the Continental Army outside of town. General Thomas Gage is the head of the British Army in Boston. He's also the governor of Massachusetts. And he basically puts Boston under a kind of lockdown. It's difficult to leave. It's a town under siege. It means that provisions are hard to get in, whether it be food or fuel. Importing goods and things like that is pretty much non-existent. It's a harsh time. And we can see how harsh this time is in the burial register at King's Chapel, because they record around 70 deaths between this period of 75 and 76. And that's a level that was significantly higher than what it had been in years past. So you can kind of see some of the effects, the lingering effects on the population, sort of responding to the effects of being under siege. And you also have the names of several soldiers of the British Army. And we have them here. These are both from, this is May and June of 1775. May 75, we have William Anser, Sergeant of the 65th Regiment, George Walker, again of the 65th Regiment, and John Blakelock, 65th Regiment, all under Captain William Hudson, who we'll come back to, and then also James Thurston, also of the 65th Regiment. Now, reading the history of King's Chapel, the Annals of King's Chapel, published in the 19th century, they look at these names and speculate sort of wildly that these are men who were probably killed in some action with the American colonists. I don't think so. It seems to me that these are men who probably died of disease because the British soldiers brought smallpox to Boston. The town under siege is sort of ramped with disease, especially among the military camps. It doesn't seem that any of these men here died in any form of engagement with colonial soldiers. Now, below, we have men who absolutely did die in conflict with colonial soldiers here. We have Captain William Hudson, whose men are the men listed above. John Taylor, Sergeant, again with Hudson in the 65th Regiment, and John Brewer, Lieutenant, in the 18th. These men here, Hudson, Taylor, and Brewer, were more than likely killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill or died from their injuries sustained at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British, suffer about 1,000 casualties. 80 officers are killed in the battle. And you can see that here, the effects there. William Hudson and Taylor, some of those officers who were killed. Now, moving on, I mentioned, how you see this increase of deaths in the burial register during the siege. This is an example of one. Caleb and Mary Blanchard were two congregants of King's Chapel, and two of the members who stayed with the congregation through the Revolution into the 1780s and even on until the church ordains James Freeman and becomes, a Christian Unitarian church. These are some of the people that really stick through and maintain the congregation during this period. And you can see here the name Daniel Blanchard of Caleb and Mary, age 1 year old. So you can see here again the effects, again, lingering of the city under siege, this town under siege. These are difficult times, and they affect really everyone in town, anyone who remains in town, regardless of their status or politics. You can see a little bit of that here. A very hard time. You can see that here, especially for Caleb and Mary. Now, the siege of Boston ends in March of 1776. That's when the British Army evacuates Boston after George Washington and the Continental Army fortifies Dorchester Heights, the cannon stolen from Fort Ticonderoga. They strike a deal with the British basically to allow, the army and anybody who wants to go, people who remain loyal to the crown, to evacuate safely, with the understanding being that then Boston will not be burned to the ground. And so Reverend Henry Kaner of King's Chapel is one of the people who chooses to go when the army leaves. He's given some time to kind of gather some of his effects, but not many. But some of the things he takes are items associated with King's Chapel. He takes the church records, some of them, the church communion silver, some of the communion linen as well. And he writes down this message here in the Register of Marriages, which I have some of the text of right here. An unnatural rebellion of the colonies against His Majesty's government obliged the loyal part of his subjects to evacuate their dwellings. Public worship at King's Chapel became suspended and is likely to remain so till it shall please God to change the hearts of the rebels or give success to His Majesty's arms. Now, Kaner is certainly doing this and taking all these items with the idea being that the church is going to close. It can't operate without a minister. He's the minister. It can't operate without him. And it is going to close for a time after evacuation, though that was not inevitable. And in fact, there was an attempt made to continue to use King's Chapel as a place of worship throughout the rest of the American Revolution. Now, just a little bit of context. The evacuation, not only does Henry Kaner leave the minister of King's Chapel, but so does the minister at Trinity Church, one of the two other Anglican churches in town. His name was William Walter. The Old North Church had already been closed for over a year because their minister, Mather Biles Jr., had been fired, or he resigned in April of 75. He flees as well. And so all that Boston has now in terms of Anglican ministers is the assistant minister at Trinity, Samuel Parker. And even he was about to leave when basically his senior minister, his boss, William Walter, convinces him to stay so that at least the remaining Anglicans in Boston would have a minister to preach to them. And as a result, though, there aren't that many Anglicans in town. There's only one minister in town. So many kind of decide among Boston that it doesn't really make sense to have, 2 or 3 Anglican churches for the time being. It's really thought that they should meet at one. And King's Chapel, the congregation, meets on April 8th, the remaining congregation, and they write to Trinity Church. This is Dr. Thomas Bulfinch, later warden of King's Chapel. He writes, "Inasmuch as the number of those who are of the Episcopal Church in this town is to become so small as to render it difficult for them to support more than one clergyman, and as the King's Chapel, by being situated nearly in the center of the town, will accommodate each church better than either of the other churches would." And so here, again, Bulfinch is offering up King's Chapel to be used by all of Boston's Anglicans. It would be the sort of center church there. But unfortunately, The wardens at Trinity Church write back to the congregation at King's Chapel and basically say that they don't really want to do this. They're going to continue holding worship at Trinity Church. And if the members of King's Chapel wish to attend, they're welcome to. And that's what's going to happen. The members of King's Chapel are going to worship at Trinity over the next 6 years until 1782. And as a result, the burial register during this time, there's a big interruption. We don't have the burial records for this period at King's Chapel because these burials weren't occurring at King's Chapel. But I have here, unfortunately, I don't have an image of it, but this comes from the Trinity Church burial record. And we can see again, this is Caleb Blanchard and Mary Blanchard, 2 members of the King's Chapel congregation, June 12th, 1777. Again, the death of an infant, James, in this case here. Again, kind of showing that, still a harsh time in Boston, even after the end of the occupation and the siege. Now, while the congregation is, attending worship at Trinity Church, King's Chapel does see some use. Now, one, there was an agreement made with the congregation of the old South Meeting House that they could come and use King's Chapel for their worship services because the interior of their church had been pretty well destroyed by the British Army. They had converted it to a stable. And so it's under this time that we have the funeral to Dr. Joseph Warren. He's here on the left. Now, Dr. Warren had valiantly served at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and toward the end of the battle, he's shot and killed and was buried in a grave right there where he died. His body is not recovered by his family or by his friends until after the siege of Boston ends in March of 1776. But his body is recovered and a proper funeral is held, and that's done at King's Chapel. Again, interesting that you have now kind of both sides of Bunker Hill. You have those soldiers from in the burial register, and now Dr. Warren being eulogized at King's Chapel by the man on the right. His name is Perez Morton. He's going to be a pretty major figure in the church in the post-revolutionary era, and his eulogy at King's Chapel in the spring of 1776, again, a few months before the Declaration of Independence, very strongly advocates for independence from Great Britain. It's a very fiery and political speech, which is in line with Dr. Warren and his personality as well. Now, getting down into the crypt, we have this lovely picture here from Halloween a few years ago. We want to kind of move in and kind of get into a little bit about what the crypt even is. It's a burial space beneath the church. It's a series of tombs. These tombs would have originally, they'd be sold by between families, and you'd basically just kind of stack up coffins inside with a simple type of wooden or stone door to close them up. Almost all of these tombs, again, were family owned, which we'll get into a little bit later, but there is at least one that was not, and this is the Stranger's Tomb, which brings us to our next bit of revolutionary history. Now, this right here, this obelisk outside of King's Chapel, is an often overlooked memorial, but it represents a really interesting point in the history of the chapel and the history of the United States as a whole. This is a memorial to a man we really only know as the Chevalier. And so who this man was and what he has to do to King's Chapel is fairly interesting. So he was a member, or was with the French Navy, I should say, that arrived in Boston in the summer of 1778. This is right after, or a few months after, the United States has signed this alliance with the French. This was a major turning point for the revolution. The war is going to be heavily supported by the French in the later years. And this alliance is going to be really key to winning, the war for independence. I mean, I think we kind of take for granted as Americans, we backdate our independence to July 4th, 1776. But important to remember that it took, years after that for the war to actually be won. Peace is not signed until 1783, and there's fighting basically all the way up until that point. And this French alliance is really one that was key to sort of winning on the battlefield here. But this alliance was almost put in jeopardy almost immediately by an incident that occurs in Boston in the summer of 1778. Now, the French fleet was trying to arrive down in Newport. They're blown off course. They're in need of provisions. They end up anchoring down in Boston and setting up a very simple series of ovens to bake bread for their sailors. Now, in Boston at this time, again, just in the process of recovering from this brutal siege, it's a period of war, and there is definitely a lack of provisions and food. And so when the sailors of Boston see this French ship, and again, the French for years have been the enemies, deep enemies of the, not just the English, but especially of the colonists here in Massachusetts, who for years have been fiercely Protestant and have viewed the French as this big enemy. There's intense amounts of anti-Catholicism in Boston. That's sort of a Boston tradition at that point. And so to see these French, foreigners, Catholics, baking this bread on the dock while people can't eat and can't put food on the table in Boston, this is going to anger a lot of the sailors who see this, and they go down and start a little fight. They end up beating up two of the sailors there, and one of them, again, a man we know really only as the Chevalier, is killed. Now, I've been having his monument up here for a bit, but you can see why this was a big deal. The Chevalier was at one point the Chamberlain. He was a member of the court of the Count d'Artois. That was the brother of King Louis XVI, and later he himself would be King Charles X of France. This is a man who absolutely is connected, and it's seen almost immediately that this could turn into an international incident. This could, potentially tank this very key and crucial alliance with the French. And this is where King's Chapel comes in, because they need to, perform some sort of funeral service for the Chevalier. They need to bury him somewhere. And it's decided, in part, with some input from George Washington, the Continental Army, and the sort of forces here in Boston, that what should be done is that he should be interred underneath King's Chapel in a secret funeral service privately, as opposed to a big public one, so as to not attract, more potential for rioting. And that's how the Chevalier, this French sailor, this former Chamberlain of the Count d'Artois, ends up in the stranger's tomb at King's Chapel. And this is an image of it here. It was bricked up in the 1820s. But this is, again, where, usually people who either work for the chapel or, were poor and couldn't afford burial elsewhere, might be interred. And so that's where the Chevalier ends up, and, where he remains today. The monument out front has been there since basically World War I. It was meant to be put up in the 1700s, but they put it off for a long time. And it's not until, again, more relations were needed with the French that it ended up being built, and it sits out front of the chapel today. Now, moving on in the crypt here, what I have here is one of the images here that shows the ownership of each tomb. I know it's a little hard to read, but I couldn't really get it to show correctly here. I wanted to show this particular image because tomb number 2 is listed on this one as being owned by Griselle Apthorpe, the same woman who was helping out Christopher Sider, I mentioned a little bit earlier. And because she owned that tomb, I have this image here too, which is almost the same one, but it lists her husband's name. So a little less cool in that department. But why I want to show this is the list of those tombs underneath the chapel dated to 1813. Because a whole bunch of the names on this list, these tomb owners are people who end up evacuating Boston when, the British leave in March of 76. And a lot of these are people who are never going to come back. People who bought this, tomb space beneath the chapel with the intention that this would be their final resting place, and the final resting place, potentially of their family, their children, their grandchildren. And they never get that. They're never allowed that. You can see here, let me go back here. Ooh, losing it a little bit. There we go. Get back to this one here. We've got one such tomb owner, Jolly Allen, Boston merchant who sort of infamously goes to flee on the day of evacuation. But the man he hired to command his ship to get him out of town was sort of some kind of con man who didn't actually know how to command a ship. He ends up running aground off of Cape Cod, where he's arrested. He's able to escape to London, where he dies in 1782. He writes in his will that after the troubles were over, his remains should be removed to the family vault under King's Chapel. Even with this great separation and this, great break of independence and of evacuation, you can see someone like Allen still wanting to be interred underneath King's Chapel, something that probably doesn't occur, but definitely something that he still would have wanted. Another one we have here is William Vassall. That's tomb number 4. And Vassall was another one who, would have liked to have been interred underneath the chapel in this tomb that he owned. But they bring up in the annals, the history again of King's Chapel, that because, he was a loyalist under the Constitution, the 11th Amendment, his property could be seized by the government of the United States. He wasn't entitled to that property. He had attempted to sue to get his home, which is now the known as the Longfellow House in Cambridge. It's where George Washington had his headquarters during the period that he was here with the Continental Army outside of Boston. And basically the courts, and then later the Constitution confirming this, ruled that these people who fled, loyalists, didn't have a right to this property, that this property was effectively giving up by leaving, by, declaring their allegiance to the king and the crown. And that extends to this type of property. I mean, this is effectively property. And we have here too, tomb number 9, Charles Paxton. On the left here, former collector of customs in Boston in the 1760s. And for a time, probably the most hated man in town for his sort of ambitious climb up the ladder toward a high position in the government, as well as, his zealous enforcement of these Parliament policies of collecting tax and assessing duties. Famously, he's literally hanged in effigy in a protest on November 5th, 1767. And underneath this hanged version of Charles Paxton, they put this devastating message saying that he was every man's humble servant, but no man's friend. As if to say, yeah, he's doing all he can. He'll work for the government. He'll collect your taxes, but we know the truth. No one actually likes him. No one would talk to him. No one in town wants anything to do with him, which is a pretty brutal thing to say about a man like that. And so he's someone who's going to flee when the evacuation happens. But if you noticed here, interestingly, in 1813, they write underneath his name, the name Clements. And what I have here, I know a little tough to read. This is actually the warden's notes from 1797. And it says here that they voted to settle with Mr. Clements for any claim he may have had on tomb number 9. Basically, can be inferred here that Mr. Clements had put a claim on a tomb number 9 under that guise that, Paxton, by escaping and leaving, had given up his right to that property and that it should be able to go to someone else. Obviously, the warden seemed to agree here, and that's how he ends up being on this list as well. And I should mention, too, as I kind of wrap up here a little bit, that a number of these people I've listed, specifically Vassall, and also this gentleman, Louis Dubois, were also people who, when King's Chapel began the process to become Unitarian, when it sort of made the decision to ordain James Freeman as the first Unitarian minister for the chapel, these people, even though they had long since left Boston and again never returned, wrote back in protest, basically trying to stop the ordination of James Freeman, even though they aren't a part of the chapel anymore. They aren't even in this country anymore and were mostly well settled away, which brought a lot of scorn from those who were trying to make the congregation, trying to do this for those who were local. And they even write about Dubois and his brother that they were, I believe it's his brother, hadn't been around, hadn't heard enough of James Freeman, notable, again, that they're trying to exercise this influence still all these years later, even though they had to give up, their property here that they had acquired due to that American Revolution. So what I'm trying to wrap up here on is that, the Crypt and obviously the American Revolution, the evacuation of Boston has this really profound impact on King's Chapel, causes it to close for 6 years, loses a huge portion of its congregation, or a third of it, I should say. It loses its minister. But there are still a whole section of people who continued to maintain the congregation. That's how the congregation was able to continue into the 1780s. And by nature, too, this extends down into the crypt. Again, these people, these families purchased these tombs with the idea being that it would be theirs forever, that it would be their final resting place, that it would be their children's final resting place, their family's final resting place. But it wasn't meant to be, again, due to that big break of the American Revolution. So I'm going to wrap up